let's start. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. As everybody's coming in, maybe we'll wait before we start the actual presentation for a few minutes, which is not too bad because my second half of my PowerPoint is still loading. As usual, we seem to have people from all over the world, which is really wonderful. And for some of us, it's warm, and for some of us, it's cold, and some snowy, like Finland. 18 degrees in Mumbai. 18 degrees in Mumbai. That's a lovely temperature. Very nice. Cold and snow where Sarah is. So as usual, here's our slide that introduces the conference, Parapsychology and Anomalistic Psychology Research and Education, January 5th through February 14th, and open and available for the next couple of years, plus all of the substantive well, actually, all of the live classes will ultimately be up on our YouTube channel. Now, let me take a look. Let me go over one, and you can sit and stare at my biography while I'm looking to see if I can upload the second half of the presentation, because there's two halves. Yay, it's there. Okay, so this is my biography. You can see it in the recording, and you can also see it uploaded in the classroom spot a little later on. The PowerPoints are not as yet uploaded, but they'll be uploaded after class. So let's just get started. I have set up two parts to this presentation and put a kind of a preview of how history of science works internationally. I'm very, very brief, to kind of give you an idea of how we as a field have tried to get together. I am focusing on what I know, which tends to be more in the Anglo-American context, although thanks to Carlos and colleagues in Europe and Asia and in Latin America, I have some connections out in those directions. The conversations over the last week or so, especially the list that we've recently been given by Jani from Finland, have given us a view of a wider effort towards solving some of the problems of parapsychology research. I'm not going to focus on areas, places that I know that deal with anomalistic psychology, with a couple of exceptions. So this is really going to be more focused on psychical research, parapsychology research as we go along. And it's a geographical view, so essentially what I'm going to be doing is giving you a guided tour of the people and the interests of some of the main areas, units, university units, and research units that deal with parapsychology. So let's get started on one. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about is Carlos and I spent 6 years doing history of science at Duke University back in the 80s and the very early 90s. And the thing that was there were two things that were emotion causing. One was frustrating and one was very enlightening. And the frustrating part of it was that even back then, I don't know how it is in history of science programs today, but certainly back then, the focus was very much on Western science. And there was this notion that, science didn't start until the 12th century in France. And okay, we've got the Greeks and all that stuff, but let's not go too much farther across the globe than, say, the Middle East. And we had the luck to have people in the class and people in our cohort at Duke who were from India and who knew the Chinese literature and knew literature from other countries. And at the time, what's now known as revisionist history, it was then very modern radical history, was starting to be published at a great pace, in which authors were bringing out the history of Asian science in China, in the ancient world, in India and elsewhere, and also expanding the notion of what science was. Scientific texts, T-E-X-T-S, tended to talk about, prior to, say, the 1980s, science as if it was entirely an Anglo-American affair, with a few people thrown in from, Italy and the Italian Renaissance, and the scientific quote-unquote revolution was tacked back to the Renaissance period in Italy. many new authors started to come in and say, wait a second, there has been science going on since the beginning of time. If science is observing the world, learning to make tools, trying to come with an explanation for what you see around you and how the natural world is, science is as old as we are as a species in a sense. Organized science, maybe not, but there was certainly very strong organizational points prior to the Renaissance period. The problem in the old days, obviously, before some of the advantages that we have, is that there was a slow process in building these networks of people with similar interests, and they were few and far between. Communication was difficult. Education was difficult. They were as separated by languages as we are, by national interests and politics and so on. And it was just a much bigger world in terms of the ability to forge a network. So there was an enormous amount of science in Asia and the Middle East predating Western science, and the dissemination went through travelers and traders, through exploration and contact in difficult times. The reason why I have a picture here of the statue of Moses Ibn Tibbon is this gentleman who was operating in the 13th century, came from a family of Jewish physicians who were very interested in the translation of earlier texts. And they got a hold of Greek and Arabic texts, especially Greek texts that had been preserved in the Middle East and transferred through to Europe with the expansion of the Islamic caliphates in the Middle Ages. And they began to translate a lot of these Arabic and Greek texts into Hebrew. And this was a very important movement of knowledge, in the sense that once things got into Hebrew, many of the Western European scholars who were trained in Hebrew and Latin could begin to translate these things into Latin. And then from Latin, they went into the vernacular languages of the various countries. So this translation effort that was going on in Marseille in the 13th century, and that predated Moses Ibn Tibbon, his father also did this work, his son also did this work, so the family itself was kind of a hub of translation. And I have a reference to a couple of places for more information on that family, one in English, one in Italian, and I'm sorry to say it's Wikipedia, but they look like solid entries. People like this particular family were very important in bringing through the knowledge of previous centuries, and then that would disseminate along with the rise of the university in the Western world in the 12th century and 13th century and so on. So that was kind of what was happening there, and you can see that the language problem, which we suffer here in this class, was very much a problem in terms of disseminating information and building networks to get that information across. And text needed to be preserved and then translated and then circulated in their translations. And then, of course, new science needed to happen, and Maimonides and many other people in the Islamic caliphates and in Western Europe and all over the planet were constantly at work. Not tons of them, because getting an education was difficult, being literate was difficult, lives were short, and so on. But there were networks being developed. And Henry Oldenburg is another kind of example of a network builder. Henry Oldenburg was born in Bremen, and he was educated at Oxford. He became the secretary of the Royal Society in London in 1663, and for quite a long time they didn't pay him for his work. He was intensely trying to search for a word, but this was a guy who, if he was on Alive Now, he'd be on every single social media network there was, because he had an enormous correspondence on behalf of the Royal Society, and he wrote to people all over the world and had a number of languages. I don't remember all the details of his life at the moment, but there is a link on the last page of this PowerPoint to where I got some information today about Henry Oldenburg. He was the person who was working on the publications and was getting information out to people in other countries and carrying the information about research and experimentalists and experiments and so on back to the community of scientists and scholars in London. the Royal Society, and then their publications also disseminated out further. So basically, science communication requires a network, and it requires connections. And as we have moved into the modern era, and those kinds of things are easier to establish, science communication has grown. But there are still, as we'll talk later, there are still language barriers and other barriers to that. So Carlos, he's done 2 wonderful PowerPoints that were made for the Utrecht conference, and that will be put up into the course area, into the poster session area for week 2. He, in his introduction to the history of the first, one of the first international conferences, certainly the first international conference that was put together by the Parapsychology Foundation, it occurred in 1953, and it took place in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And in his introduction to the history of this international conference, that was organized specifically to bring people together from a variety of different cultures and countries. And he talked about some of the congresses, the international congresses that had gone before. So 1953, of course, was not the beginning of international conferences in parapsychology, but the conference movement itself was kind of an invention of the 17th and 18th centuries and 19th century, and had to do with started locally and expanded out. I mean, for instance, in London, I think one of the big boosts to any kind of intellectual discourse, believe it or not, were the coffee houses that arose because of the importation of coffee from Latin America. They were mainly male preserves, and Robert Boyle and some of the members of the early Royal Society of London would get together and chat, and this was going on all over any of the countries who had this. There's actually a book out there that talks about the impact of coffee on the growth of science. I'm sorry, the phone is ringing in the background. It will stop after 4 rings. So these are some of our conferences, and you'll be able to see more about that prehistory when you take a look at Carla's PowerPoint. Now, because we're back at the Parapsychology Foundation, and because this was very important, this conference and a more recent conference, we wanted to give some information about the Utrecht conferences. And this was the one in 1953 that was put together by the Parapsychology Foundation. This is actually the monthly newsletter of the Parapsychology Foundation, and this is a building on the campus of the University of Utrecht that was used for the conference. And Carlos, in his introduction to this conference, which you'll see, talked about 4 individuals who had attended earlier international conferences in other countries and also attended the Parapsychology Foundation conference in Utrecht. William Mackenzie from Italy, William Salter from England, René Soudray from France, and Thorstein Vereide from Norway. And forgive me if I've ruined his last name. The folks who went to that conference who are still with us, I think, is basically one, isn't it? DJ West from the University of Cambridge. I think he's the last remaining attendee of Utrecht. Is that true? And Scriven, Michael Scriven, who must have been very young when he attended that conference. I am also going to be uploading a PowerPoint that he did about the recent conference in Utrecht. So this conference was an international effort organized by Eileen J. Garrett, who founded the Parapsychology Foundation. That's this first picture here. This is Frances Bolton, who was a very wealthy woman and a congresswoman here in the U.S. She was one of the funders. This is Professor Tenhoff from the Netherlands, who was one of the organizers. And then here's a list of other people who were involved in the organization and some select members of the executive committee. These are photographs from the conference, which took place in a room at the University of Utrecht, in that building I showed you, that we also had the 2008 Utrecht II conference in. So this was an effort to bring everybody together, and because it was extremely well funded, they had a nightly newsletter that came out every morning at breakfast. It was worked on over the evening and would have information and news about the presentations of the day before. It was a very unusual kind of a conference and organized on a large scale, primarily to create these connections between international researchers and set up working groups that could move the science of the field forward. And it was a very, very important, that's right, Ten Hoff was holding the chair in the Netherlands. So this is important to us in the sense that it was an effort to bring people together and get over some of these barriers of location and language. This is a picture from Utrecht 2, which was organized by, the conference content was organized by the Parapsychology Foundation. In fact, Carlos was in, I would say, the primary mover in constructing the conference. Lisette and Mrs. Coley, Lisette's mother, and I, and Wim Kramer and others had input into that, but Carlos was really the one that crafted it. The conference was partially funded by the Parapsychology Foundation in the sense that we were all working for the Parapsychology Foundation with the exception of the folks in the Netherlands and being supported by our salaries to do that. And then getting people to the Netherlands, all the Netherlands venues and the amenities of the conference, which were many and so on, were funded by the Johan Borgmans Fund in the Netherlands. And Wim Kramer and his colleagues were the ones who kind of ran the local show, including the members of the Parapsychology Institute in Utrecht. And this was the same type of conference with the idea of let's bring everybody back together from across the planet insofar as that's possible, and talk about what we've been doing and what the research is like, and talk about where we need to go next. And so that is an important effort there. And that's another PowerPoint that I'm putting up into poster session, the one by Carlos that was a kind of a review of what happened at the conference that he prepared some years ago for the Division of Perceptual Studies group. So these are efforts to break down these barriers. And then there have been many, many other international efforts. The Parapsychology Association conferences, the Society for Psychical Research conferences, the Encounter conferences in Argentina that were put together by Dr. Alejandro Parra and the Instituto de Psicología Paranormal, Encounter conferences that happened in Brazil and were put together by many different organizations. The Euro PA, so regional PA conferences, local country-based groups that are dedicated to research and so on, and then smaller local groups of people that just get together to talk about it. So the research moves ahead in both intellectual ways and in the social context in which these intellectual conversations take place. So, for example, up here we have a very tiny version of the group photo from the Parapsychological Association convention in Vienna in 2004. This is a picture of an international group that we put together that met, I think it was actually the lunch of the Parapsychology Foundation affiliates, wasn't it, in Halifax in 2007, because that's in a program of the Parapsychology Foundation. Lisa, I'm so sorry. This is a project of the Parapsychology Foundation, the international affiliates. If you go to the main website, you can see the listing. And this was a lunch that we had for the affiliates who were present at the Parapsychological Association conference in Halifax in Nova Scotia. This is a picture from a break at the Parapsychological Association conference in Durham in 2012. And this is Carlos meeting up with Dr. Patrick Geisler, an anthropologist who's been in the field for many years, in the PA conference in Curitiba. Carlos is giving me a look because I put this picture in. But essentially what I'm trying to illustrate here is that we come together across language and location boundaries for small meetings, for big meetings, and to hook up with people that we haven't seen in a long time. And it reinforces that social context and those social networks reinforce our interest in the field and our hope for the field going forward. And also, we are sharing what we're working on and what we're doing, and discussing informal presentations and in the face-to-face version of our chat box here we're discussing our methodologies, our problems, our experiments, our publications, the situations in our countries, and so on, setting up collaborative research networks, and et cetera. So the barriers to this kind of global participation in the research effort are still languages. We're working in English here. Many of you are second language speakers of English. Many of things are about back in the 19th century. Let's say in the 18th century, you had to have French. That was the lingua franca of that was the way in which you communicated Western research to a great degree. In the 19th century, it was German. Some of the, especially in psychology, some of the best laboratories and the best conferences were taking place in Germany. In the 20th century, it's shifted to English. This does not mean that a non-native speaker, that will go there, Emiliano, if that makes you feel better. We don't know what it's going to be in the 21st century or forward in terms of what the languages are, but language is always a key thing. How are we going to talk to each other? Our distances for face-to-face conferences are considerable. It makes it hard for us to meet each other in our own countries. The funding for face-to-face conferences is very difficult to put together because things are expensive. Travel is expensive, local venues are expensive, and so on. And then the dissemination of conference activity proceedings have been, in the main in the past, in publications, usually in the language of the main conference organizers, and available as books. And over the years, that's gotten easier in terms of being able to go to somewhere like an online bookstore and grab something and have it shipped to you. But back in the day, I mean, even back when Carlos started working in parapsychology, you needed to write to a particular bookstore and get on their list and tell them what you were looking for, and then wait months and months and imagine what it was like in the 17th century and the 16th century and so on. When we were in the history of science classes at Duke, we got a big kick out of poor old Paracelsus. Theophrastus Bombastus was his name, and he was very interested in medicine and healing, and in order to do the kinds of research that he did, he literally packed his belongings into a sack and put them on a stick and set off walking from one main abbey or university library to the next. So today we're living in an age in which so many of these things are so easy to get a hold of, and yet there are still barriers. For instance, in quite a lot of the clinical parapsychology work is in German, and it's difficult for us to get over here to be able to use that and so on, but it helps. So our opportunities today is that we now have online conferencing venues such as this one. People are writing vlogs, they're doing video logs in English and other languages. We can make online networks and discussion groups. There are ebooks that are cheaper to get there, and you get an instant, if you have access to that, you get instant delivery. There are websites, portals, lists, YouTube, and other user-based online video channels. The common language in parapsychology today is starting to be a triumvirate, I think. Quite a lot of research is very good and very important research is in German and hasn't been translated. There's a lot of translation going on with some of the Italian literature, but it's not perfect. There's a lot of work going on in Spanish-speaking countries, but they don't always get to English-speaking countries. And probably English is still kind of at the top of the pyramid in terms of what language are we more likely to use in our conversations. But having a single language and not being able to translate really effectively from one language to the other very instantly. Exactly, Eduardo. There's Russian, Chinese, there's Japanese parapsychology. Many of the, at least one of the Japanese journals produces English abstracts. There's literature in French, there's literature in Scandinavian languages. I mean, we are still at this point where we are divided by our languages in our countries. This is just my resources. And you'll see when you look at this that I've got some links that you can go and get some information. And I will be putting up more info in the poster sessions. In this area, I'm going to try and give you kind of a tourist view, a tour of some of the places that I'm familiar with, and some of the people that are working there, and some of the things that they're working on. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is that exactly, Lynn, that's so true. We need to ensure that China and Russia, Asian countries, and so on are not excluded. English is not the dominant language of the world, but at the moment, a great deal of what we have going in our field is in English, and we need our own Moses Ibn Tibbon. We need a translation center, and a lot of us have been saying this for 20, 30 years. We need a translation hub that will take everything from every language and push it out into the other languages. I always think if the European Union can have 130 official languages, science should have as many languages as possible, and so should parapsychology to move it forward. We really need a true global interconnection, and we're moving in that direction, but we're not there yet. So I apologize that this comes from my experience, but that's the only experience I've got. So let me give you the benefit of what I have learned over my I usually say over my 30 years in parapsychology, but thanks to Yanni and his list, I'm starting to say 40 because he's got some of the people that I used to work for back when I was in my 20s on his list. So this is the Breadth of Psi Research, and it is leaving out, as you can tell, China and Japan and so on. They should also have been on this list. But what I'm going to look at today is South America, Brazil, and Argentina, and there are other countries in Latin America where parapsychology has serious groups of people. In Europe, Italy, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Scotland, and England. We have in the, if we don't have it up there now, we will have it up there, Massimo Biondi's Parapsychology in Italy presentation, which expands what we know about that. And as usual, with the purpose of the course, we're talking about places where research is being done, as opposed to groups of people who get together to develop their psychic abilities or to talk about their abilities or to provide self-help to each other. We're focusing on research locations. I am not mentioning, for instance, Olaf Blanke and his group, and some of the other areas where there is anomalistic psychology going on. I'm focusing on parapsychology, psychical research places, and a few of the anomalistic psychology places. So this is the breadth of what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the lecture. First, we're going to start with South America and Buenos Aires in Argentina. And we talked about this just a little bit when, thank you, Yanni. We talked about this a little bit. Before I go on, let me say, feel free to get in touch with me with any kind of information that you might have about other countries and other groups and other research efforts, because that's something that I'm very interested in. If you're interested in spiritualism and mediumship and the study of spiritualism, there's a 3-volume set that's out by Christopher Moorman that includes chapters on different countries as well, how spiritualism got to that country and what were the focuses. Were people looking at it as a religion or trying to scientifically test things, or both? So Alejandro Para's story is quite amazing. We've known him since the early 1990s, when he did not have an undergraduate degree and was running the institute out of his home, and was very seriously interested in the field, but because of the economic conditions in Argentina, was not able to do the education thing as yet. But he made connections to academic colleagues and to other individuals with an interest in the field, and they formed the Instituto and began to provide services, courses, opening up a library, and doing programs in education and so on. And over the years, since the beginning of his interest in parapsychology, he has gone through with a BA, an MA, and a PhD, and is now a licensed clinician and a faculty member at universities in Buenos Aires. And the Instituto itself has grown. They published a journal for many, many years. They have this amazing resource in Spanish, which has lots of abstracts and freely available articles and many other things for Spanish speakers. The principals are Dr. Alejandro Parra, Jorge Villanueva, Juan Carlos Argibay, and Juan Manuel Corbetta, who is here in the class with us, as well as Alejandro. They have done primary research on online surveys of psychic experiences. They have the counseling program that you've heard about, coupled with personality and individual differences research, and also counseling practice research. They have a focus on apparitions, hallucinations, dissociation, boundary thinness, among other topics in their research. They conduct an adult education program, and they produce online and print publications at a very prodigious rate. There's quite a lot of material that's been put out by this group over the years. In South America as well, the other big kind of location for these kinds of things, and there are many. There's a group in Recife. There's people in Curitiba. I'm not sure if I have a slide for Curitiba. But as always, this is a representation of the country itself. The University of Sao Paulo, which is primarily Dr. Wellington Zangari, who's a professor of the social psychology of religion, and his wife and colleague, Dr. Fatima Regina Machado, who will be talking to us later. Dr. Maraldi is a graduate of this program. Dr. Fabio de Silva, who's going to be speaking later on in the program, is also one of the graduate students. Their story is also very interesting. And in these tales of Carlos's and my tale, and in our histories, and the history of Alejandro, and the history of Wellington and Zangari and Fatima Machado, are very much a story of how you find a way to do research, be productive, provide services, provide education in a field that is a marginal discipline. And I'm going to write this term into the chat. What I mean by a marginal discipline is a discipline that lives outside the boundaries of mainstream science, and in that sense has some severe difficulties that are structural and social. So we often, as a field, get an enormous amount of criticism about not having made sufficient progress since 1882. We get criticism about not being able to be more definite or more tied into science as a whole since as we've gone along. And a lot of this this difficulty comes from the fact that we are beyond the margins, but beyond the border of mainstream science. We're typically considered to be either illegitimate at the foundation, that obviously these experiences don't exist and people are having some kind of breakdown in sensory acuity or in perception, and certainly in the ability to be a critical thinker. So that's one thing we hear, and because it's characterized in that way, those of us who are interested in the science of the field, how do people have these experiences? Who has them? What do they say about who we are as human beings? We are painted with that brush of having some kind of mental problem or some kind of deficit in our intellectual abilities or some kind of deficit in our education. One of the old histrionic, kind of overstated texts that talk about this is an old document by Frederick Marvin from the 1870s in the United States, who proposed that there was a psychiatric syndrome known as mediomania. And mediomania was something that it covered the symptoms, what he called symptoms, of mediumship. So if you thought you were in contact with the dead and you were bringing through messages and you were holding seances, you were suffering from this form of hysteria called mediomania. If you were a scientist or a scholar or an academic or an intellectual who was interested in mediumship, you were also suffering from mediomania. And there's been less overblown kinds of arguments that have basically painted us with this brush of some kind of a problem. If we're interested in this material, there's something wrong with us. So we actually suffer a little bit from what people who have experiences suffer from. We don't say what we are. It's one of those, what do you do for a living? I'm a, you know, that kind of thing. So because of that, you're cut at, it's very difficult to get jobs in the academy. It's very difficult to get jobs in research institutions. And you have to kind of build your own opportunities. And we have watched Wellington Zangari and Fatima Machado since the early 1990s attempting to do this. InterC, which is now a functioning research unit at the University of Sao Paulo, has been in other universities as they've made their trek across the academy in Brazil, and was their own institute for a while before it became university-based as well. So it's a long trajectory to being able to do this in the same kind of context that every other kind of scientist is allowed to work. Now, today, they are having a very important impact on the study of these phenomena in Brazil, and there's a PowerPoint in week 1 that talks about the InterC, the consolidation of anomalistic psychology in Brazil by Vanessa Corredato and Wellington Zangari is a description of what they're attempting to do. And Wellington is doing something very unique with his group and with his teaching in his graduate schools. He's trying to hold anomalistic psychology in the sense of the search for a conventional explanation at the same level of balance as the paranormal idea. So the two things are equally honored and equally pursued among his group of students. And that's a very interesting kind of balance to attempt to strike. So these days, their primary research, and this is what Wellington and mainly his students, his graduate students, is psychic functioning from a conventional and a paranormal perspective, transliminality, dissociation, psychological and personality correlates, the psychology of belief, which is very important, and then seemingly psychic functioning in religious context. So there, quite a lot of his students are interested in phenomena that takes place in, as you saw in Dr. Miraldi's talk, in the Umbanda context, or in the Santo Daime context, or in some other religious context inside Brazilian society. So the principles obviously are Wellington Zangari, Fatima Machado, Dr. Miraldi, and Dr. De Silva are recent graduates, and as you can see, there's quite a nice group here that's always changing, and I think we have several of the students actually signed up for this course. So this is a unit that's functioning. So if you want to learn Portuguese, this is a great place to go and get your PhD, and you can't beat it for music or food or friendliness or any of the rest of it. And it's a very nice unit, a very good library, very good group of people. And this is where Fabio de Silva is, and he was also a professor at this particular faculdade in Curitiba before he got his PhD. So you see this in countries where the economic possibilities for education may be difficult or expensive, that people who have these kinds of intellectual interests just get on with the work one way or the other and build up, hopefully, their academic expertise as they go along. So this is Faculdades Integradas Espírita. This is a spiritistic university. It is, back in the day, in the 90s, it was not accredited by the local state, partially because of the hold that the Catholic Church has on, had at that time, we were told, on the accreditation process. But they've been going on for many, many years, and they've had a number of very good students come out of there, as well as an ongoing research program. And their primary research has been in Ganzfeld research, which you'll hear about tomorrow from Kathy Dalton, and you've heard about a little bit as we've gone along. This is a kind of way of inducing an altered state in the experimental room and getting, testing telepathy and clairvoyance and so on, precognition. DMILS, which is distant mental influence on living systems. This is basically a psychokinesis kind of experiment and is thought of as a psychic healing analog. You're running experiments to see if people really can affect the physiology of some other living person or creature, an animal, or be affected or block that kind of incoming activity. Dream telepathy, which is experiments that use a variety of different types of techniques to harvest dreams you have during a night when a target might be present in an experimental room in a laboratory somewhere, and you're trying to dream about that target. And they're also very interested in psychic functioning with children, and they've done some work on psychic training, trying to train up people to be able to produce the phenomena in an experimental context. And that's going to be the content of Fabio's talk towards the end of the program. So Fabio da Silva is one of the primary people. There have been a cast of characters over the years, but he's the guy these days, and for the last maybe 20 years. And Professor Nadir Gans as well, and other faculty and international collaborators and graduate students. In fact, Dr. Kathy Dalton actually went down there and helped them set up their Ganzfeld laboratories back in the 90s, so there's quite a lot of connection there. Also, we have a more recent entry into the Brazilian scene, and this is Dr. Alexander Moreira Almeida's group at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Minas Gerais in Brazil. Now, this is a federal university. They have a lot of money available for them. They're an interdisciplinary group. They have a Facebook. They have a YouTube channel with lectures about their research and their point of view in English and in Portuguese. They're one of the recommended channels on our Parapsychology Online channel if you want to wade through to get to them. It's actually, the name of the channel, I think, is NUPES, which is the Portuguese acronym for the name of the unit. Which is, it looks like nucleo, it's the nucleus of, thanks, Carlos is telling me, the group of research in spirituality and health. It's a very interesting group of people, and their primary focus in terms of research are on the personal and individual differences of mediums, personality and individual differences of mediums, then the epidemiology of religiousness and of health, how mediumship may impact or come from your mental or physical health, and how it may impact on it as well. You'll see in his talk, he'll be talking more philosophically, but there's some really wonderful research out there in which he's looked at how people who have experiences that might get themselves diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder, when they move to a spiritistic group and become involved with a group and train as a medium, they need less medication, they have much less hospitalizations, and they find a very productive and fulfilling way to integrate their experiences into their daily lives. They're also very much interested in the history of scientific research into spirituality in Brazil, and that's the main focus of Dr. Moreira Almeida's wife, Angelica Aparecido Silva de Almeida, who's a PhD in history. Dr. Saulo Freitas Araujo and a number of other researchers and graduate students are involved very actively, and they're drawn together from an interdisciplinary group from psychology, from psychiatry, from history and philosophy, and other disciplines. So it's a very interesting group in the sense that it's a very wide kind of focus with a very pro phenomena point of view at the underneath of it, at the foundation of it. In Europe and Italy, and you have a PowerPoint from this gentleman here, Massimo Biondi, who's a physician and a science writer and involved with the Bologna group and other groups in Italy. There's a PowerPoint from him that's in the course materials that outlines current research and groups and so on in Italy. This is Dr. Patrizio Tresoldi, who was a speaker in our November conference, and if you'd like an invitation to get into that conference and take a look at his presentation, just write me and I will send you the invitation. Dr. Tresoldi is a psychologist and a statistician, and along with colleagues such as Lance Storm from Australia and Johann Baptista, who lives in the United States, and Michael Dugan and other people, has done this meta-analytical technique, which is a statistical technique in which you combine studies from a variety of individuals and you look for the overall evidence. And they talked about the review, talked about meta-analytical reviews, and Dr. Daniel Benner also mentioned them, and Dean Radin's book Entangled Minds is a good source of the reviews of the meta-analyses up to that date. It's basically pulling together lots and lots of experiments and taking a look at the overall evidence for a particular phenomena. So Dr. Tresoldi is a very important newcomer over the last maybe 10 years or so in the field, working in presentiment and working in the meta-analytical stuff and doing all kinds of experimentation, and he's at the University of Padova. Massimo is based personally in Rome and then is also involved with the Bologna group. So Patrizio focuses on phenomenology and physiology of the non-local mind, quantum physics, meta-analyses, statistical issues, and Massimo focuses on the history of psychical research. He's written a couple of textbooks and is very knowledgeable about the scene in Italy. And if you're Italian, or you're, it would be worth your while to get to Bologna to go to the Bozzano de Boni Biblioteca, because they have an amazing library of wonderful resources. Let me speed this up here. In France, the center of parapsychology to some extent is the Institut Métaphysique International, which is in Paris. It's a long-time organization. It's been around since the early 19th century or 20th century. It's currently run by Dr. Mario Varvoglis, who's actually from Greece and then trained in the United States, got his education in the United States and went back to France. And this is, he's listed at the top. He's very interested in experimental parapsychology and creativity and so on. This is Dr. Johar Siamed, who works in the clinical side of the field. This is Tomas Raberon, who will be doing a talk for us on presentiment later in this course, who is also involved in some of the clinical things that have been developed in France. This is Dr. Renaud Evrard, who spoke in our November conference on clinical parapsychology, and he's very knowledgeable of the history of the field. And there's a group of younger researchers who have established clinical services and are doing research together at the Institute. And this is Pierre Bancel, who is a mathematician and will be speaking for us on global consciousness later in the conference. And this is Dr. Bertrand Mehus, who has written some very important books on the history of this psychical phenomena, parapsychological phenomena. Carlos will give you more information in the chat about his books. He has a 2-volume set that's very important, and many modern articles, many more recent articles as well. So Germany is one heck of a site for a lot of these things as well. These are the people, and we're going to have another slide that I'll talk about what they're interested in. Eberhard Bauer. I don't think I have Wolfgang Fach on this slide. No, I don't. But we have a PowerPoint in week 1 that's about counseling and clinical services at the IGPP in Freiburg, and the research that's done on clinical issues. This is Irgi Wackerman, who I'm not quite sure where he is now, if he's at Gießen or where, but he's connected to the IGPP group, which was also for many years a very large funder, and they have probably the best library in the field, multilingual in Freiburg, that's available. So if you can get to Germany, this is a great place to visit, and Yanni has put up the description of the place. Harald Antmanspacher is a physicist. Where's Stefan? I have Stefan Schmidt in the list. Harald Wallach, who is not on this, who's down here. He does spirituality. Thilo Hinterberger. Oh, that is Stefan. This is Thilo Hinterberger. Jupp Hautkuper. Many, many more. There are graduate students at the university there and people on the staff who are doing research, and then the IGPP funds a number of laboratories at Gießen and in Freiburg. Bauer and Hovelman mainly work on the history of the field. Von Lukadu, Antmanspacher, and Hautkuper on physics and theoretical models. Hinterberger on psychophysiology and distant mental influence on living systems. Beltz, Von Lukadu, and Schmidt on counseling psychology and clinical parapsychology, and to that we need to add Wolfgang Fach. Harald Wallach on transpersonal psychology and parapsychology. Wackerman, Antmanspacher, Von Lukadu on non-local consciousness, and then, as you can see, more of the interests that are there. So Germany has been a very, very important period, important location for some very important work in the field, and they have a close connection with the HJBF in the Netherlands. They've had some conferences together and so on. And that's very important work, but for those of us on this side of the pond, it's difficult. We don't, the U.S. language learning situation is not very good, and an awful lot of us are not German speakers or readers, so that's another reason why I always talk about we need our own Ibn Tibbon, we need our own translation hub in this field. In Sweden, we have two locuses of scientific parapsychology. Dr. Adrian Parker has been at the University of Gothenburg for a very long time. He's actually originally from England and received his PhD at the University of Edinburgh back in the 70s. Dr. Parker specializes in altered states and has made a lot of advances in the Ganzfeld technique. Kathy Dalton, who will be speaking tomorrow, also spent some time at their laboratory. The second location of research that's more anomalistic and kind of neutral on anomalistic is in Lund at the University of Lund, and this is Dr. Elsa Cardeña, who was actually born in and raised in Mexico and had the majority of his professional life here in the United States prior to going to Sweden when he obtained the Paul Thorsen Chair of Psychology and Hypnology at the University of Lund. He's very interested in hypnosis, dissociation, and psychic functioning, and has had a number of graduate school students who've gone on to teach and work elsewhere. He will be giving a talk at the very end of the course on anomalistic psychology and psychopathology. In the Netherlands, there are many folks, and I'm only focusing on a couple, and Egil Asprum actually made this list because we met him at the University of Utrecht at the Utrecht II conference, and he writes on history of esoteric movements and psychical research and parapsychology and so on, and is a very interesting guy. And if you're on academia.edu and are interested, let me put down that reference, interested in any of these types of historical topics, he has quite a lot of published papers that are available there. Dr. Dick Bierman has been around the field for a very long time. He was at the University of Amsterdam. He held Tenhoff's chair, didn't he? At Utrecht as well for many years. He's a psychologist who's really interested in physics and has been very much on the cusp of, he's at the very beginning. He's always ahead of the curve. That's what I'm trying to say. He's always ahead of the curve. He's always doing things before everyone else does them. The very first online course in parapsychology he put together in the 1990s when you had to be a computer genius, essentially, to run one of those courses. And he's always been ahead of the pack in terms of physics. He's very much a founder of the observational theories in parapsychology, and also presentiment, and also has done some very important work in distant mental influence of living systems. So let's move on here to Scotland. Carlton and I and Kathy Dalton, who you'll see tomorrow, were trained at the University of Edinburgh in the Kersler Parapsychology Unit. This was founded by Dr. Robert Morris in 1985 when he became a Kersler Professor of Parapsychology. And there are about 20 plus graduates that came out of that program. Now in the program is Dr. Caroline Watt, who was a student of Professor Morris's. She's very much interested in parapsychology of belief, experimental effect, experimental parapsychology. And Dr. Pete Lamont, who's actually a historian from the University of Edinburgh, he teaches the psychology of deception and the history of psychical research in parapsychology. In Bob Morris's day, the unit had a very balanced point of view. We were all very interested in psychic phenomena and had a very positive attitude toward it, but he did have graduate students who were more anomalistic psychology, in the anomalistic psychology camp or in the negative camp, absolutely sure that none of these things exist, and trying to prove how we can be so misled by our own experiences. Dr. Richard Wiseman is one of those. So he tried to keep a very balanced unit there, and at its height, when Carlos and Kathy and I were there were 8 to 10 postgraduate students, a very lively laboratory, and more funding for research than any other segment of the psychology department. Now the Kersler Parapsychology Unit has been downgraded from a research unit, a research location, to a special interest group for students who are interested in the field. And both Caroline Watt and Pete Lamont continue to supervise and teach, but they are now regular members of the university staff for the Department of Psychology and are not paid by the Kersler Fund. So it's a very different situation now. Many good graduate students coming out of there, but not at such a large clip as there was, not at such a large rate as there was when we were there. Some of Bob's students have gone on to set up their own research laboratories. Dr. Deborah Delanoy, who was a student of Dr. John Beloff, like Adrian Parker was, went down to the University of New Hampton. Dr. Chris Rowe, who was a graduate student when we were, established the first unit at Northampton when it was still called Mean College, and it's had a trajectory in organization over those years. He's now the professor of research in the Department of Psychology and runs the laboratory at Northampton. They have about 20 faculty and staff and students who are engaged in research all the time. If you want to see his presentation on remote viewing in Gonsfeld from the November conference, just get in touch with me and I will send you the invitation. If you are already in that conference, I suggest you go over there and see it. It's a really good talk. I also have some things on parapsychology online that he's done bookmarked. He will be speaking later in this a course on kind of a new area of research for them, which is the qualitative examination of the experience of being a medium. And his primary partner in this new line of research is Dr. Elizabeth Roxborough, who is actually one of his students at Northampton. Dr. Christine Simmons-Moore, who you'll see later on, was also in Northampton, PhD. So we always talk about the Morris miracle and Morris's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren because many of his PhD students have gone out and founded research units or had students of their own in this very positive, very serious approach has come out from his initial philosophy of what we should all be doing that was established when he came to Edinburgh. Now, these are other universities in the UK. Some of them are involved with. Some of them have kind of flowed out of Edinburgh in a sense. York University. This is Robert Robin Woofit, who is a sociologist and is very interested in conversational analysis. This is a book of his called Telling Tales of the Uncommon. He's done quite a lot of work on how people talk about their psychic experiences and how psychics themselves give information and establish their credibility and so on. Very bright guy, and he also has graduate students that work in the field from a kind of neutral point of view. This is another one of his books, Speaking In and Speaking Out. This is Nicola Holt Hutchinson, who's now at the University of I think at the West of England in Bristol. She is a Northampton graduate, and her point of view is, her particular interest is creativity and psi. She is a co-author on Christine Simmons Moore's book, Anomalistic Psychology, with Christine and Dr. David Luke, who you'll see in a second. And Kathy Dalton will also talk a little bit about her research. This is David Wild, who's at the University of Manchester and does OBE research. This, I think, is an article that was about some of the research that he was doing. This is Dr. Craig Murray and his book, and he's at Lancaster University and works on OBE research. Back in the day, if you look at my education PowerPoint about education context problems and needs, you'll see that back in the day there were more university opportunities here. We weren't involved with the SPR or the Scottish SPR. In England, there was nothing going on. Now we're a little bit less positive and not as many of us over here in university situations, and the UK has 16 different universities that have some parapsychology going on, where students can at least incorporate parapsychology into master's and doctoral degrees. And some of this is down to Professor Morris and his influence on the scene in the UK over his 19 years as the Kerslow professor. And then other sites in the UK, University of Derby, Dr. Ian Bacon, who got his PhD with all of us. He does fields of investigation, ghost poltergeists and hauntings, and he teaches a sequence on parapsychology for undergraduates. Dr. Matthew Smith, who actually trained with Richard Wiseman at the University of Hertfordshire, he and Kieran O'Keefe are at the Buckinghamshire New University, where they are working both in positive psychology, psychology of luck, and parapsychology. And Kieran O'Keefe runs the School of Parapsychology, which is a training program online and on-site for, thank you, Sarah, for field investigation in particular. And Kieran is also a student of Dr. Richard Wiseman. At the University of Simon Sherwood was at the University of Greenwich last year, and is now kind of a free agent in the Northampton area, and he was a faculty member at Northampton for quite a while. He's a very interesting guy. He does apparitions research, is interested in the black dog phenomena, and has a website about it, and that's just fascinating. Very interesting to watch. Dr. David Luke, who's one of the co-authors on anomalistic psychology, specializes in psi and psychopharmacology. He's done a lot of research trips to Brazil. He's also a past president of the Parapsychological Association. And he and Jack Hunter recently published an anthropology postgrad named Jack Hunter, who also publishes the online journal Paranthropology. They have recently published a book called Talking to the Spirits, I think it is, which is a very good anthology of mediumship phenomena with very many perspectives from a lot of different individuals who are contributing to that volume. And there's some books that are coming out. Psychopharmacology is the study of what certain drugs, hallucinogenics and so on, do to one's perceptual and apparatus, and your sense of identity and your sense of spirituality, your ability to have or to enhance psychic phenomena, and so on. Carlos will put up a link to Talking with the Dead is Hunter. Talking with Spirits is the Hunter and Luke book, and then there's another one out called The Survival Hypothesis by Adam Rock, who you'll see in a second. And there's some books on the horizon. There's a new handbook of parapsychology that is coming out, I think, next year, that will have a lot of articles from different writers and so on. So this is Australia. We've got Landstorm at the University of Adelaide. He was a colleague of Michael Thalborn, who was mentioned in yesterday's talk, and he's very much interested in both transliminality and shamanism and is involved with the Australian Institute for Psychical Research. This is the University of New England, where Dr. Harvey J. Irwin, who's one of the co-authors of one of the most widely used parapsychology textbook in English, Introduction to Parapsychology. He was at University of New England for many, many years, and his professor was also a parapsychological researcher back in the day. Dr. Adam Rock is now the guy who's there. He's very interesting. He's done a lot of work with Lance on putting out anthologies. He's interested in mediumship and shamanism. He's a co-editor of the New Advances in Parapsychological Research series. Number 9 is out, number 10 is in progress, and number 13 is on the, or 11 is on the horizon. He also works quite a lot in qualitative methodologies. And then we're over here to the U.S., and you're not going to see virtually much located in a university since the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Laboratory closed in 2007. This is the only unit of this type in the U.S., and it's at the University of Virginia. It's called the Division of Perceptual Studies in the Department of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences. Dr. Bruce Grayson just recently retired as the head of this unit. He's a very well-known near-death experience researcher, and this is the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, which was published a few years back. He was one of the authors. Jim Tucker is now the head of that unit. He's also a psychiatrist. He works in reincarnation along the lines of Stevenson's investigation of memories of previous lives. Dr. Edward Kelly and Dr. Emily Kelly are also with this group. Irreducible Mind is the magnum opus of their particular perspective on the field and the phenomena and so on, and this is also co-authored. Bruce Grayson was involved, Adam Crabtree from Canada, Michael Grosso, a philosopher from the United States. And this is an 800-page book, and it's well worth a read if you can get a hold of it. This is a book that Emily put together on Dr. Ian Stevenson's research called Science, the Self, and Survival After Death. So someone asked, I saw it fly by, why is there so little research in the U.S.? And that's a consequence of the economic situation and especially of organized skepticism, in my opinion, the way that conservatism has taken over the academy, and we've just been pushed farther and farther from the margins. And it's also a funding thing. Back in the day when the American Society for Psychical Research was active in scientific research, they received a large grant from Chester Carlson, the gentleman who invented the Xerox machine, so copy machines. He had the first patent that I know of in the U.S. and made a lot of money, and he funded the American Society. He funded this unit at the University of Virginia. He funded the Rhine Research Center and so on, and at the moment there's nobody like that, nobody like Francis Bolton, who funded the Parapsychology Foundation along with Mrs. Garrett. So the situation in the United States has changed significantly. This is the Rhine Research Center, which was also funded partially by Francis Bolton and Eileen Garrett, and then later Chester Carlson and other donors, and now it is a very, very small organization that basically focuses on education and local events, and very little research is happening there at the moment. John Palmer is the editor of the Journal of Parapsychology. This is John Kruth, the executive director. Sally Rhine-Feather, who was the executive director, but is still very much involved. And this is Bill Joines, an engineer from Duke University, who has done some research, but very little research goes on there at this point. More research is coming out of Dean Radin's group in the research laboratory at the Institute for Noetic Sciences on the West Coast, out of Global Consciousness Project, which is you'll hear about from Roger Nelson, and that's an offshoot of the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Laboratory, which is closed. There's a new laboratory opening that has opened called the Tank Lab. Not very much research is happening even in private organizations here in the United States, and if you look at my other talk, you'll see that it's very difficult to find a place to study in an accredited fashion parapsychology in our country. So we're telling people, if you don't want to learn a foreign language, go to England. Otherwise, learn German, Portuguese, and you'll be better off, or French, and you'll be better off than you are for opportunities here in the U.S. Cassandra Vighton is the new president of IONS and was very much a part of Dean Radin's laboratory, and Dean will be speaking to us, I think, at the end of next week. I put, this is East Coast and Southwest, Christine Simmons-Moore, who will be talking about anomalistic psychology in the process of putting together that book, and her view of how to balance that field. She's at the University of West Georgia. She has some students and at the undergraduate and graduate level. The Psychical Research Foundation is somewhat virtual. The president of the foundation lives in Texas. Brian Williams will be talking to us towards the end of the, in upcoming weeks on neurophysiology in ESP, is based in Nevada, and Cheryl Alexander, who's done work for the Psychical Research Foundation, is here in North Carolina. It was a physical entity in Durham, North Carolina back in the day when Dr. Bill Roll was alive. It actually it was for a long time in Durham and then in Chapel Hill part of the time. So in cities that are close by here. But now it's more of a virtual organization, and they are conducting research. This is the Windbridge Institute, which is in Tucson, Arizona, and is an offshoot of the now closed University of Arizona laboratory that Dr. Gary Schwartz had founded. This is the primary researcher, Dr. Julie Beischel, her husband, Mark Bacuzzi, and these are their main collaborators, Adam Rock from Australia and Dr. Chad Mosher. They have a very interesting program looking at, oh, and I forgot to take this off. Now you can tell I stole this from a lecture that I gave to our students at the Rhine. They have a process of certifying mediums. They have to not only kind of prove that they can work with the experimental procedure, and not every medium is comfortable with that procedure. So that people have gone through this program and not been certified is not a comment on their ability, but just says that these are folks who are able to work in this very kind of artificial way of doing readings. And they also require their certified meetings to go through grief training and grief counseling as well. And they've published a lot of research. Yes, and actually Arthur Findlay, if you will probably hear about Arthur Findlay College in Dr. Bro's talk, because Northampton and Arthur Findlay have made kind of formal relationship. He and Dr. Roxborough have taken courses, she longer than his, at Arthur Findlay, and most of the mediums that they work with have been trained at Arthur Findlay, so yes. And this is a wonderful book if you haven't seen it. It's very conversational, and it's about their research and how Julie got interested and so on. Basically, that's my little geographical view, and this little picture is from 1980 when a group of us from the Midwest Psi Research Institute in Chicago, which Yanni has been showering me with newspaper references to over the last couple of days in the course discussion, this was something that I founded with Dr. John Bisaha and Brenda Dunn when she was still in Chicago, and a couple of other people, and later on this lady here, whose name is Terry Feldman, took it over, and it became part of another group which carried it on for a number of years after I moved to Durham. So this is Terry. This is me, believe it or not. This is Dr. Jeff Resnick, a neurophysiology who was at that time an undergraduate student and had taken my parapsychology class at Northeastern Illinois University. This was another member of our group at that time, Dr. Barbara Lovitz, who's a sociologist, who was at the time undergraduate student at University of Chicago. And I put this picture up because I want to tell those of you who are in your 20s that it doesn't matter where you start, just keep going. And I had the I don't know if it was pleasure initially to have Yanni dig up my ancient history with the Illinois Center for Parapsychological Research and some of these other organizations I was in before we founded the one that the one that's represented by this picture. But you know, it's a process, and with luck, you're going to live for many decades to come and be able to do wonderful things. So it doesn't matter where you start, just keep going. And this picture, by the way, was taken at the door of the Divinity School at Duke University in November of 1980, when our group drove from Chicago to be present at a conference on Dr. J.B. Rhine's life's work. He had died the preceding March, and a conference was held at Duke that following November, and it was the first time I ever met anybody in the field, and I met John Palmer and Charles Honorton and Dr. Rex Stanford and Dr. Morris and Dr. Roll and so on. We wandered around, the four of us, like we were at a Beatles concert, just absolutely floored and excited at the opportunity to be there. I had also attended the memorial service in the previous March, but I didn't meet quite as many of the luminaries from the research side until this November conference. So I am me in WizIQ with anybody that I have missed. You can also email me at nancy@theazire.org, so the next time I teach this, it's a little bit better. And if you would like to put questions into the chat, we can do a few questions and answers, and then we'll wrap up because we're already at 90 minutes almost. So thank you very much, and thank you for being patient while I was uploading my photo finish slides here. Well, thank you very much. Anybody have any questions that they might want to ask? I'm really looking forward to re-recording this because I'll be able to read the chat box at that point. Thank you. My goodness. Well, okay. Well, oh, here we have some communication and interested. Wait, I have to. You're flying by here, guys. Let me see if I can hold on to this. Trevor is saying communication across disciplines as well as geography, multiple disciplines. Yeah, Bob Morris liked to say that this is a interdisciplinary. Parapsychology is an interdisciplinary problem domain as opposed to a discipline of its own, meaning that physiology, psychology, sociology, anthropology, history, clinical psychology, I mean, you name it, biology, zoology, you name it, the disciplines that are set up in the academy all have something to do with the kinds of phenomena that we're dealing with. They may be sensory, and then we perceptually interpret them. They may have something to do with physics, and they probably do with how we exist in the world. People have set up organizations, which is the province of sociology and anthropology and ritual and so on. So it's very difficult frequently to discuss across those disciplinary boundaries, as Trevor was kind of hinting. So in addition to the languages, you have different specific languages for the disciplines and different agendas. And sometimes it's kind of hard to talk about that. But the more we make an effort to interpret and interconnect the different disciplines and their approaches, the better off we are. Let me see what else was up here. Yeah, open-mindedness is definitely the key. What we got going here. Canada. There are a number of groups in Canada that are relatively small. There's a group in Montreal, and there's been actually some very important recent research done on dream telepathy at York University in Toronto by a gentleman named Carlin. So there is research going on, and Dr. Benner, of course, and so on. Antonia Mills is at the University of, I think, British Columbia or northern British Columbia, but she's working in reincarnation research with First Nations. Dr. Buddy Wynn ran a parapsychology course for decades at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan. So there is work going on up there, and not quite as systematic and more individually based. And if you look at the education talk that I uploaded, you'll see a bit more about what's going on in Canada and about the idea of the difference between having a research unit and having an individual instructor who's willing to work with you in a very particular way. Immense Barus, Dr. Immense Barus also is working in Ontario, and I've forgotten the name of the college at this point. But he's got a couple of books out there that are very important for our field. I have nothing to. I cannot answer a static electricity question. I have to say, you might. I'm not sure who we have. We're talking about psychokinesis in general. Carlos, would you like to tackle that? What does static electricity have to do with ESP healing and telekinesis? Okay, so let me close my mic and I'll. You want to just talk loudly? Okay. I'm going to repeat what he said. He said psychokinesis, so mind over matter, has been explained in some instances by a manipulation by static electricity, or possibly a manipulation of static electricity. And this is why you will see in some of the PK talks, and actually Cheryl Lee Black may be talking about these kinds of experiments because I think she's taken part in them. You'll see things put around a target for a psychokinesis experiment to rule out movement and changes in wind and static electricity from the body and so on. But it's probably better to ask Cheryl Lee that, or take a look at some of the references. Yeah, definitely third person to first person approaches. Carlos gave you information about the Owen Group, the Monroe Institute. Let me move up a little. And Persinger at Laurentian University. Exactly, I forgot. The Monroe Institute doesn't do systematic research. They gather information about the people who come through the programs, and their new head of research, Dr. Jim Lane, who's in the psychiatry department at Duke University, is hoping to make that more systematic. So they've got lots of data, but not a lot of systematic analysis up there. They're up in the mountains. It's a beautiful place. Andhra University, exactly, has had quite a lot of parapsychology over the years. At one point, Dr. PVK Krishna Rao and there are a number of, and Dr. K. Ramakrishna Rao as well, who was also an executive director of the Rhine Center, have done a lot of work, and there's a journal, and Sonali Marwaha can give you an idea of what the situation is there at the moment. But they have quite a lot of research has come out of Andhra Pradesh, yes. Okay. Yeah, the Monroe Institute is definitely interested on helping people achieve certain phenomena and explore that phenomena. It's a very, very interesting place. Carlos and I have been up there just for an afternoon's introduction to the place, and also to for Carlos to give a speech to a Spanish-speaking group who came in for the Gateway program, which is their OBE program. And actually, Joe McMonagle's wife, Nancy McMonagle, who's a stepdaughter of Robert Monroe, is now the head of the Monroe Institute. So if there isn't any, are there any other questions related to this geographical look? Yanni would know better than me about Mumbai, and please ask that question to Sonali Marwaha as well. There she is. Is she there? No, that's someone else. And I'm going to close the course off, I think, because we've hit the 90-minute mark, and I want to thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for your patience at the beginning, and I hope that we will see you tomorrow in Kathy Dalton's talk about creativity in Psi, which starts at 2 p.m. And check the Google Calendar for more information. I'll be putting the direct links to the classes on the Google Calendar later today. So thank you very much, and see you soon. Good night, good afternoon, good morning, good rest of the night to everybody. Whoops, hit the wrong thing. Was going to extend the session. We don't want to do that. So good night, everybody. Thank you.